Yo, what's going on everyone? It's me, it's Jinsula. I hope you're having a good day. Welcome to today's Pokemon Go video. Today we're going to be going over the top 15 non-legendary Pokemon in Pokemon Go, and every single one of these Pokemon are those you should invest into. The reason why I say that is because not only are they really good for PvP battles, but they're also phenomenal when it comes to PvE. You don't necessarily need a whole bunch of legendaries in your collection in order to get ahead in Pokemon Go. You just need to invest into the right Pokemon, and I really do hope that the Pokemon that I list in this video is going to help you get ahead. Now, something to keep in mind is that I tend to be a little bit more biased towards PvE content, so a lot of the Pokemon that I'm going to be talking about are primarily good for raid battles as well as Team Go Rocket battles. But there are a few Pokemon that are also really good for PvP, and I'll explain how you could use them in PvP battles so that you could get the higher ranks within the Go Battle League. Alright, so this is going to be the first Pokemon that I'm going to be talking about, and yes, this Pokemon is primarily really good for PvP content, and it is none other than Swampert. This Pokemon is phenomenal, and I would consider it one of the most useful Pokemon in the game. The reason why I say that is because not only is it good for PvP, but it's also pretty good for PvE content if you do not have a bunch of legendaries. The reason why I say that is because when it comes to Swampert, it's considered a top tier raid attacker when it comes to water types as well as ground types. But unfortunately, IVs are definitely going to matter, and it is not future proof because once you get yourself a really good Kyogre, it's going to be much better than this Pokemon in terms of water type raid damage. And then when it comes to ground types, the same story is applied with Groudon. This Pokemon does get outclassed by that legendary Pokemon. But until you get those legendaries, this Pokemon will hold its own. It's definitely really strong in terms of raid damage, and if you do not have yourself a full team of really high IV Kyogre or Groudon, then this Pokemon is the one you will want to go with. Now, in terms of PvP, Swampert is insanely good. Like, it doesn't matter what league you bring it into, if you have a Swampert built for specific leagues, like the Great League or the Ultra League, it's going to be super effective against a majority of the Pokemon that are considered meta. It has been at the top tier within the Great League for a very long time, and if you happen to have yourself a Shadow version with PvP IVs, you're almost guaranteed to get ahead because so many Pokemon are weak against Swampert, and very few players have the right Pokemon to deal with it. Now, the next Pokemon I'm going to be talking about is, of course, Mamoswine. This Pokemon is phenomenally good when it comes to raid DPS, and it's also got some uses in PvP as well, specifically in the Master League. Without question, if you need an Ice-type raid attacker, this is the one Pokemon you need in your collection. It even outperforms a whole bunch of legendaries, and as of right now, it is considered the absolute best, and it's very easy to obtain as well. Now, if you happen to have the Shadow version of this Pokemon, you should definitely invest into that because it's definitely going to be your absolute best Ice-type raid attacker. It even outperforms Mega Evolutions. That's just how insanely powerful it is. But moving right along, we got Lucario coming in next. This is a very powerful fighting type Pokemon that is also quite useful in PvP, but mainly in PvE content, this Pokemon is second to none. I really do like using Lucario in a lot of different situations, like with Team Go Rocket battles as well as raid battles, mainly because it has the duo typing of fighting and steel. That is a very powerful type combination because they do complement each other really well. There are certain Pokemon that are really strong against fighting types, but are also weak against steel types. So with that kind of type coverage, you're going to be good to go with this Pokemon. And it also has a very powerful moveset, so if you need fighting type raid damage, this Pokemon is definitely going to be worth your while. And then next up, we're going to be talking about Sceptile. This is a Pokemon that does have a Mega Evolution, which is considered the absolute best when it comes to grass types. There's really only one Pokemon that outclasses it, and that is Kartana. This is a very powerful non-legendary Pokemon, and it's definitely one worth investing into. Grass types are very far and few between when it comes to raid DPS, so this is definitely one of those Pokemon that is worth your investment, especially because the Mega Evolution is incredibly powerful when it comes to grass type raid damage, and you do not want to miss out on having it, especially when it comes to certain raid bosses that are weak against grass. Now, moving right along, you cannot have a list like this without including Metagross. This is by far one of the best steel types you will ever get, and that's pretty insane because there's a lot of steel types that are really good. but when it comes to Metagross, it is by far the absolute best. This Pokemon can deal an insane amount of raid damage, and it's also incredibly useful for PvP as well, considered top tier when it comes to the Premier Master League. This is one Pokemon you need to invest into, and if you have yourself a 100% IV, it definitely needs all of your rare candies and Stardust. However, do keep in mind that when it comes to Metagross, this Pokemon is heavily reliant on its community move, which is Meteor Mash. If you do not have that move, then your Metagross is going to be somewhat useless. So make sure you have that move on your Metagross, otherwise it's basically just going to be there as a trophy. You definitely need that one move, and it's going to elevate this Pokemon to new levels. Alright, moving right along, this Pokemon is actually really strong against Metagross, and it is of course Rhyperior. Now, when it comes to ground type damage as well as rock type damage, this Pokemon is actually considered top tier in terms of raid DPS. Yes, it does get outclassed by plenty of legendaries out there, but regardless, this Pokemon is still really good. And in a lot of situations, it's comparable to those legendaries. It is definitely one worth investing into, and you will want to make sure you have Rock Wrecker because that move does make it a top tier rock type raid attacker. Alright, moving right along, we have Tyranitar. This is another pseudo-legendary that's going to be appearing on this list. And my god, this Pokemon is all around really good. It has a Mega Evolution, which makes it one of the best Rock type or Dark type raid attackers depending on what moves you have on it, and in terms of raids, it's just insanely good. It has a really high TDO score, it has really good moves when it comes to Rock types or Dark types. It's incredibly versatile. Depending on what you need in your raid battles, you could use this Pokemon to take down those Pokemon. It's quite rare that you will have a Pokemon that's going to be considered top tier for two different types, and Tyranitar does fit that bill. I would say Tyranitar is primarily used as a Dark type raid attacker, considering that there's plenty of really good Rock types, some of which you will be hearing about in this video. But when it comes to Dark types, this Pokemon is definitely going to be top tier. I think there's only one or two Pokemon that's going to outclass it in terms of raid DPS, and those Pokemon are a little bit harder to get, but when it comes to Tyranitar, you do have that Mega Evolution that you should take into consideration. This Pokemon is really strong, and it's definitely worth investing into, especially if you want to get ahead in raid battles, because Rock types as well as Dark types are incredibly valuable considering a lot of legendaries are weak against them. Right, moving right along, the next Pokemon I want to talk about is also a Pokemon with a Mega Evolution, but even without the Mega Evolution, it's considered top tier, and that is, of course, Gardevoir. In terms of Fairy-type raid damage, this Pokemon is second to none, and if you happen to have yourself a Shadow version that's 100% IVs, that is definitely one you will want to invest into, because it is going to be by far the best Fairy-type raid attacker. And in terms of the Mega Evolution, that's also going to be the absolute best, but in terms of being a generalist, it could be used in that way as well. But you need to consider that a majority of legendary Pokemon have the Dragon typing, and Dragon types are weak against Fairy types, so this is definitely one Pokemon you should invest into if you're trying to get as many raids done as you can. Now, the next Pokemon is another Fairy type, and it's known for its Fairy type raid damage, but it's not going to be as powerful as Gardevoir. However, you should still invest into this Pokemon because there's a lot of different situations where it is going to be extremely useful, and that is of course Togekiss. The reason why I say Togekiss is one of the top non-legendary Pokemon in the game is because it is incredibly versatile. It can be seen as a top tier raid attacker when it comes to Fairy types as well as flying type damage, but it's also a top tier Pokemon when it comes to PvP. There's plenty of uses for Togekiss, especially in the Ultra League and Master League, and it's definitely one worth your investment because it is really good as a Pokemon, and if you have yourself a good one, you're definitely going to use it in some way. Alright, now this one might be a bit of a controversial entry, but I'm going to say Heracross is another top non-legendary Pokemon. The reason for that is because of a recent addition to this Pokemon, and that is of course its Mega Evolution. That makes it a top tier bug type or fighting type raid attacker, and in terms of those two types, there's not many to choose from. Especially when it comes to bug types, this Pokemon is second to none, and you will want to make sure you have a good one in your collection. Unfortunately, unlike most of the other Pokemon on this list, this Pokemon is a regional Pokemon, which means it's not going to be available freely to the worldwide public. public. However, Niantic does frequently have this Pokemon in raid battles through different events, so anytime it is in raid battles, I would say you should prioritize getting it. And of course, the Mega Evolution has been released, so I do think the Mega Evolution raids are going to be part of the rotation, and you will eventually see them in Mega Evolution raids. And when it is, you should definitely raid those Mega Evolution raids because you will want the energy as well as a high IV of this Pokemon. Now, the next Pokemon that I'm going to be talking about is, of course, none other than Excadrill. This Pokemon is incredibly good for raid DPS with ground types, and if you do not have yourself a really good Groudon, then this is your next best option. It's also really good for PvP, considering that when it comes to the Master League, there's very few counters against this Pokemon, and it does have a very powerful moveset that you can spam. So yeah, I would say that Excadrill is a top tier raid attacker as well as a PvP Pokemon when it comes to Pokemon Go. It's definitely worth investing into. Speaking of ground types, you can't have a list like this without including Garchomp. This is a very powerful pseudo-legendary, and in fact, it is my favorite pseudo-legendary in all of Pokemon. I really like Garchomp. I've used it quite extensively when it comes to raid battles as well as the Master League, and it's definitely one of those Pokemon that I'm really glad I invested a bunch of Stardust into, mainly because it's incredibly useful. It also has a Mega Evolution, which makes it really good as a Dragon type or a Ground type raid attacker, and it's definitely one you should invest into if you have yourself a good one. Also keep in mind that this Pokemon does come with a Community Day move, and that move is going to be essential for a lot of that raid damage, and sometimes in the Master League as well. Now, the next Pokemon that I'm going to be talking about is unfortunately not good for PvP, but in terms of raids, it actually matches against a lot of the legendaries that are out there with the dragon typing. And that is, of course, going to be Salamence. This is yet another pseudo-legendary on this list, and I have to tell you, it is a very powerful Pokemon. It also has a Mega Evolution, which is only outclassed by Mega Rayquaza, so if you need yourself a really good Dragon-type Mega Evolution and you just simply do not have the Mega Energy or Meteorites for a Mega Rayquaza, then this is your next best option. Alright, and finally, this leads us to the last Pokemon on this list, and the one that I have is actually a Shundo. It is going to be none other than Chandelure. This is a very powerful Pokemon that I think often gets overlooked, mainly because a lot of people see it as kind of like just a raid attacker with a lot of different legendaries that are going to be a lot better than it. However, it is still worth investing into, mainly because when it comes to fire types or ghost types, it's a very powerful Pokemon, and if you happen to have yourself a really good Chandelure, it's definitely worth your investment, because this Pokemon, like most of the other Pokemon that I talked about in this video, it is incredibly useful. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to Chandelure, it is PvE centric. There's not many cases in PvP where it's going to be useful. In fact, I would say that the pre-evolutions are actually going to be a lot more useful. But when it comes to Chandelure and raid damage, it is definitely going to be top tier, and you should invest into one. Alright, so with that said, that's going to be it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it to be informative. I really had a lot of fun making this video. I've wanted to talk about this topic for quite some time, mainly because when it comes to top 10 and top 15 lists, you typically see a lot of legendary Pokemon, which are not always accessible to the average player. But when it comes to a lot of these Pokemon, they are very much accessible, and they often get featured in a lot of in-game events. So you could see a bunch of their pre-evolution forms just numerously on the map. Yeah, these are definitely ones you should farm up because they are incredibly useful in a lot of different aspects of Pokemon Go, and you do not want to miss out on having them in your collection. But yeah, with that said, let me know your thoughts regarding everything that I talked about in this video down below in the comments. Is there a particular non-legendary Pokemon that you feel deserved to be on this list that I did not include? Make sure you mention what that Pokemon is and why you feel like it should have been on this list down below, and let's have a great discussion. And thank you so much for making it to this point in the video. If you ended up enjoying it, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if it's your first time here. And also don't forget that little bell so you can stay up to date on whenever I upload videos. Now I want to give a quick shout out to every single patron on Patreon. You make this channel content possible. If you want to support the Jinsula channel, the absolute best way to do so is by going to my Patreon page and becoming a paid Patreon member. If you do so, you get a permanent spot on my in-game Pokemon Go friends list. So if you want to interact with me in some way within Pokemon Go, like with remote raids of the friendship system, then make sure you go and check out my Patreon. And if you want to support my channel in a different way, you can do so by following me on social media. My handle is @Jinsula, and I'm on the platforms that you see on screen. Make sure you go over there and give me a follow. Alright, and that's going to be it for this video. I'm Jinsula, be safe, have fun, love yourself, and I'll catch you all later.